America is seemingly in a perpetual state of decline, but I argue it's worse than that because it's a choice. It's an active choice by the United States administration to withdraw, to disengage, allowing the likes of China, Russia, autocratic countries to step in. Right? No, that just gives it a void that allows other great powers or influential powers to come in and fill that void, and usually on the basis of an anti-American, anti-Western sentiment.
As you say, this is about the disorder. We're in a transforming world. The question is this a world in which we can live, as it were, or one that will blow up? Clearly, we're moving into a new world. We have been moving into a new world, I think, really since the rise of China. There's no doubt at all about it. And there's a new stage in that. Re-election of Donald Trump's really remarkably radical administration. So this is a big transformation.
This is The Global Gambit.
How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to The Global Gambit. Now, we are looking at the economy. There is a lot going on with the global economy after months of incessant and unnecessary conflict with Iran. But of course, the ongoing situation with Ukraine and Russia, the Ukrainians are striking remarkably into Crimea and other parts of Moscow. And all this is impacting energy supply, confidence in the markets, inflationary pressure. And there's one gentleman who we've had on a couple of times at this point, and he enjoys the show so much, he just was super keen to come back on as soon as possible. No, I was very keen to get him on. It's actually the other way around, but it's Martin Wolf, the Chief Economics Commentator at the Financial Times, and who we last had on, I think it was at the beginning of the year, Martin, when we just had the Venezuelan operation, and none of us expected the war with Iran to be quite the level that it was, and maybe Cuba will come next. But I guess, how do you look at the state of everything globally after the past 4 months of conflict in the Middle East? And we can then go into some other areas later.
Well, I suppose it's sort of a puzzle in the sense, and I wrote about this in my column this week, which was based in large part on the latest annual economic report from the Bank for International Settlements, which is a document I tend to respect because it's very independent. And the puzzle is there's one shock after another, and this last one is a big one, and it's not over, not in any real sense. Not only have we lost months of supply of energy from the most important region in the world, but the Straits don't seem to be working fully yet. The deal is sort of a deal, but not sort of a deal. And yet the world economy seems to be performing pretty well. Oil prices are not fantastically high, bouncing around, but not fantastically high. The markets are showing very strong confidence. The big stories about the AI boom remain very much there. And again, despite last year having had this trade war, which is, of course, not really resolved. So the big story I've been telling in that, particularly in that column this week, is resilience. It's partly a matter of luck or coincidence, but I don't think there's anything going on right now that suggests it'll all end, though there are plenty of fragilities, particularly in fiscal situations and in global finance. So it is a sort of fascinating puzzle in which reminds one of the sort of the famous soap, The Perils of Pauline, which somehow or other, whatever happened to her, she's always fine. And that's what the world economy seems to feel like.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. And it makes me think of when we first had a conversation almost a year ago now in your office. And I asked you along the lines of, why did the global financial system, but particularly things like the oil markets, why did they not react to the 12-day war as much as we might have expected them to do? But here we are now. Oil's back down to what, 55, 65 kind of range as a barrel. It fluctuates. But why have we not seen more of a global reaction to the war that has been expected for decades, let alone years?
Well, this war, I think, was a bit of a surprise. It was certainly a surprise to me, particularly after, was it last June, they said, well, they solved the problem. So it was a big puzzle. I think if I look at it now, there are two reasons, well, perhaps three. First, the world economy, again, has shown much more flexibility than one might expect in adjusting to these shocks. And it's partly because the products that go through the Straits of Hormuz are very, very important. But most of them, or not all, there are ways around it, at least to some degree. That's the first reason. The second is, and I have to say that I only became aware of this a little while ago, is there are huge stocks accumulated, particularly of oil in the world. China notably has huge stocks. And though the stocks have been drawn down very rapidly, and you can see that in some of the charts I've used, they're still there. They haven't gone yet. And the third reason is, I think, is captured by that remarkable coinage of my colleague Robert Armstrong, TACO. Trump always chickens out. The markets really believe that Trump is desperate to avoid a real disaster, particularly one that might affect his party's performance in the midterms, one that made American people really furious. And so somehow or other, he will chicken out. And that's what they think they're seeing. The pressure from Iran became overwhelming, and Trump, in his usual way, essentially signed a surrender document. Now they're sort of negotiating what the surrender means, what sort of control and influence Iran will have, what Israel is not allowed to do. But I think the markets clearly believe that Trump has decided this is over, and somehow or other he will manage to achieve that.
Well, so I want to sort of come back to Iran for a larger proportion of the conversation, but just on this theme, whilst we are having it, I was having an interesting conversation with someone who's a big fan of yours, actually. I owe it to her to why we had these initial conversations, just sort of shout out to her on that. But she was saying to me that even what's happening in Britain, right, with Andy Burnham seemingly going to take over from Keir in 2 or 3 weeks as Prime Minister, and sort of yet the markets have been very indifferent to what's been happening, and that's because they priced in weeks ago on this expectation. Can you say that that's largely what's happening now? The financial markets are getting better at predicting certain shock events or macroeconomic events that might otherwise not have been the case a few years ago?
Well, I think what the financial markets are doing is coming to the view that whatever goes on in the political sphere, it's not going to make a real difference because it's going to be sorted out. And the underlying story, particularly, as I said, the AI-related story, the tech story, but some others too, investment in clean energy is an example. And that's clearly going on around the world. The markets believe essentially that we're not going to have a world war. Actually, relations between China and the US, something I discussed at a conference I attended this week, actually in Bangkok, the relations between China and the US are fine. The Xi and Trump get on rather well. So the war in Ukraine, Russia's clearly not going to win. It all seems sort of contained. And so ignore all this. It's political noise. The big story is there are things driving the world economy. They're well reflected in the stock markets, and nothing big can go wrong. Now, my view, having watched the world economy for a very, very long time, is that that is usually a perfectly sensible view, except when it isn't. And there are enough fragilities in the system for it to be quite imaginable things will go wrong. But you can't time that. And if you're in the markets, you can't afford to be out of them when they're doing well. So the people who are in it stay there. And the markets are not, to put it mildly, perfect forecasters. I've never forgotten that just before the great financial crisis in 2007, bank stocks were doing fantastically well. Nobody foresaw what was about to happen. So things are fine until they go wrong. You have to remember the risks, but timing what will happen is, I think, impossible. And there are many good reasons for believing the world will struggle through okay, because basically the people in charge are not mad. They're a little bit crazy, but they're not mad. And so they don't want a great catastrophe. And if they feel they're close to it, they stop.
Yeah, but can't we agree that the world, can't we agree? It's clear the world is not what it was 15 years ago, 10 years ago. etc., right? We live in this perpetual state of instability. I just think it's the international disorder to an extent. What, are you saying it's really not as bad? Because you sounded pretty pessimistic last time we spoke, the first time we spoke,
No, I'm interpreting how the markets view it. Their view is, I have a much sort of deeper sense of uncertainty about it. I genuinely feel that despite all the risks that are obvious, that we don't know how this is going to unfold. But I think what markets feel is there are some very good stories going on of really quite profound transformations. The core relationship in the world, China-US, is manageable and managed. Trump is a wild card, yes, but he's not actually a lunatic. And he draws back before anything goes seriously wrong. And the way he's behaved over Iran is remarkable in this regard. I mean, just a little while ago, he was saying our aim is to overthrow the regime. I mean, very explicit about that. Well, he's not only not overthrown the regime, he's accepted that their position de facto is stronger than when he started the war. So the markets, I think, have concluded, and I think quite rationally on the evidence, that the man is extraordinarily flexible. And that means that he won't go to the edge of doom. And for that reason, they bet on the fundamentals and they think this thing is going to be okay. And looking at what's happened so far, that's not an insane view. We just have to remember that you never know what can still go wrong. And there are, as I said, lots of fragilities out there, fiscal positions, financial positions, great power relations. Still, you don't know what will happen in Ukraine. Putin might escalate big time. It's perfectly possible. There are all sorts of risks. But I think the market view now, the investor view is bet on the fundamentals. Don't worry about the politics because they'll never really get in the way. Is that insane? No, I don't think it's insane. It's consistent with the evidence, but it could be wrong.
Well, yeah, I'm sorry, Martin, but do you not think it's misguided? I mean, I don't know if that's you using that word, but flexible? Trump is not. Flexible gives it a certain positive connotation, but I personally cannot think of what positive things this guy does. To reference an article that you've written and a video I'm preparing for today, Friday, July 3rd, America is seemingly in a perpetual state of decline. But I argue it's worse than that because it's a choice. It's an active choice by the United States administration to withdraw, to disengage, allowing the likes of China, Russia, autocratic countries to step in, right? There seems to be this misconception amongst MAGA types, just for a reference point, that by disengaging, that sort of it gives free rein for those countries greater autonomy. No, that just gives it a void that allows other great powers or influential powers to come in and fill that void, and usually on the basis of an anti-American, anti-Western sentiment. So surely it's worse than flexible, right?
Well, we are in as you say, this is about the disorder. We're in a transforming world. The question is this the world in which we can live, as it were, or one that will blow up? I sort of covered that in a column I wrote 2 weeks ago, I think now, on the rise and fall of American hegemony. And clearly we're moving into a new world. We have been moving into a new world, I think, really since the rise of China. There's no doubt at all about it. And there's a new stage in that with the re-election of Donald Trump's really remarkably radical administration. And since they're about to celebrate the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, it's sort of very symbolic. So this is a big transformation. But it is possible, nonetheless, to see reasons why this might not be the end of the world, our world. And I did cover those in that column towards the end. I mean, the first one, to sort of compare it with the previous periods of disorder, it looks to me more like, though there are many differences, more like the Cold War than the interwar period. And the reasons for that, I think, are, though one has to qualify these sorts of judgments. In the interwar period, there were a number of dictators in power who were mass homicidal maniacs, and at least one of whom really wanted a world war because he thought he would win it. Now, this is very different from today. It's pretty clear that Russia is sui generis, but Russia itself hasn't shown any real desire to use all these nuclear weapons it has. But China and the US clearly want to find some modus vivendi, and that's certainly true of Trump, who's less hawkish in some ways than his predecessor about China. He doesn't want a world war because I think he's worked out that nobody will win that, which just seems fairly sensible. But that means that he is trying to work out a sort of accommodation with China. He also actually, strikingly to me, seems to be less keen on establishing the American sphere of interest in the Asia Pacific. In the published documents of his administration, it talks more about Latin America, which seems sort of slightly mad to me. But I think he's pretty clearly indicated that he has no intention of fighting for Taiwan. So this is a man who he's unpredictable. He does pretty weird things. I'm not saying that I feel safe with him at all, but he doesn't show him. He's clearly not a mad dictator of the interwar period type. And then there's so you've got a sort of strategic instability here with China. Yes, part of the reason for that is the Chinese think the US is in decline. I mean, one of the points I have heard mentioned in several meetings I've had is that Chinese people think, thank God for Trump, he's giving us the world. Well, yeah, but that makes it a little more peaceful, doesn't it? So for these reasons, I tend to think that it's perfectly possible to imagine this continuing for a very long time. It'll be very messy, unpredictable. It won't be at all like it was 20 years ago. Oh, it's even less what it was like in the 90s of the unipolar moment. But it could go on for a long time. Things will be managed, partly because the people concerned are not ideological fanatics. They're just unpredictable.
But just to continue on this point, Martin, because it's my wheelhouse for sure. And I kind of want to pick it apart a little bit more, which is simply that, so firstly, I'm curious what you think. Would you agree that there's a difference between decline and withdrawal? Personally, for me, the latter is worse because decline, to me, indicates a natural process which is very difficult to reverse, right? The British Empire was in natural decline, and it was the natural place for Pax Americana to take over from Pax Britannica. But now this The Economist came out with an article, I think just 2 or 3 days ago, a few days ago, talking about, America's actually, by all metrics, doing better than ever. The military is as big as it has ever been. The economy's pretty massive, 32 point whatever trillion. So by those metrics, not that those represent all metrics, it's actually doing really well. But its soft power is dead as a dodo because of Trump's seeming self-destruction. So do you not think it's a case of it's not always about China's rise as it is about America's plateau and relative decision to withdraw, which enhances its decline? Or am I overcomplicating it and it doesn't matter to you?
Well, no, I think that is important. And the world is adjusting to this. And it's going to be very complicated and very unpredictable. The Europeans are adjusting particularly hard because they have lost their anchor and they don't quite know what to do about it. But I think the Europeans have adjusted to the idea that they're going to have to make their own security, as it were. In this regard, by the way, I would say that one of the most striking events of the last bit over a year now is that essentially, and it's an important moment for Europe and perhaps even more widely, is that Trump wrote Ukraine off. He said to Zelensky, you have no cards in January 2025. So that's a year and a half ago. And now people are writing, I'm not saying they're right because it's not a field of my expertise, as if Ukraine is winning the war, certainly not losing it. So the Europeans are rather cheered up. They think, well, if Ukraine can do this, given our vast resources, the technology they're showing, well, basically, and the fact we really do outnumber Russia in every possible dimension, we could probably look after ourselves. After all, that's really cheer people up, I think. So Russia's not quite the threat we thought. And clearly Putin has a lot of stresses at home. Now, China, this is very interesting. I think what is happening is that people in the region and people around the world who have very close economic ties to China, or that China feels are, as it were, very broadly in their sphere of interest, sphere of influence, perhaps better than just sphere of interest. So they're accommodating to a varying degrees the reality of Chinese power. China doesn't seem to be showing any great sign of wanting to create a still bigger Chinese empire. It's looking to me more like trying to reestablish what used to be called as the tribute system. Well, basically, other powers around them recognize China's core interests, don't violate its perceptions of their core interests, treats it with respect as a greater power, but otherwise are allowed to go on being self-governing. That's basically how Korea operated for a couple of thousand years. And I think the more unreliable the US is, the more that's the direction people are going to go. But there are other things they can do. They can also cooperate with one another. I'm very struck with what I think I'm seeing is a closer relationship between India and Japan, potentially quite an important relationship, two pretty large economies. There are counterweights to China, even though it's, of course, the single dominant power in the region. And, of course, America is still around, as you said, lots of economic power, lots of military power. So it is disordered. It is disorderly. Nobody knows what will happen yet. But it feels to the powers that have been felt most abandoned by America that maybe their neighborhood is manageable all the same. So we won't go back to the Pax Americana. That's, I think, unambiguously clear. But the messy world we're moving into might be a manageable one. Normally, economics can go on. So to me, one of the biggest and most interesting surprises, for example, and the real surprise, given what I thought in April last year, is world trade has continued to grow. And it continued to grow because trade, the imports that used to come from China are now coming via other countries, but the Americans aren't stopping them. So that's shifted the supply chain. Well, that's something people are very good at. The Chinese haven't lost the exports. They're just going indirectly via other producers of the final goods. And Trump's protectionism hasn't been copied by the rest of the world. So world trade remains an extraordinarily high level relative to world GDP. So what I think I'm seeing, and this is a change in my view, or an evolution of my view, I think what he's doing at home is really dangerous, as it were, for the future of the Republic. But the world is showing a remarkable capacity to adapt around it. Am I going to say nothing could blow up? Absolutely not. That's not my character. But I have to recognize that the worst things, the greatest fears I had, look a little more manageable. And the way this war with Iran has gone is, to me, extraordinary, because I really didn't think, I wasn't sure. I wasn't quite sure. But the way he's backed down from any sensible interpretation of his original plans and somehow sort of declaring defeat as victory with Iran, clearly the dominant power in the Gulf, and planning to exact money from its neighbors indefinitely, that's extraordinary. Just accepting it, as far as I can see. So that's my view of the world at the moment. It could change in the next few months. We will see. China is doing really, really rather well. The most important, I think, is it doesn't have a fully functional growth model. It has a part of one, but it doesn't have a fully functional growth model. And so I think it's quite plausible that China will not be able to grow so much faster than the United States over the next 20 years.